Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Veronica Nilsson, and I am the head of the Global Support Unit. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on social dialogue, a key pillar of due diligence. This is the third and final webinar in our series. Perhaps you participated in the first one, which was on global supply chains, and then the second one was on gender. But if you missed them, you can watch the recordings, which are available on our website. But today we are going to talk about the role of social dialogue in due diligence. And I would like to recall that one of the reasons for the Global Deal Initiative is that the benefits of globalization are not always broadly shared. The Global Deal aims to mobilize social dialogue as a way to advance decent work and manage labor market challenges, so that balanced solutions can be found that work for businesses, workers, and the wider public. And due diligence can support the process of social dialogue in different ways, and that is what we are going to talk about today. In recent years, there have been a lot of debate about making due diligence mandatory. And I think France is the first country that adopted a law on due diligence in 2017. It requires that companies, large companies, I should say, headquartered in France, they have to make a plan with the measures to be taken to identify risks and prevent severe impacts on human rights, health and safety, and the environment. And this law also applies to subcontractors and suppliers. And only 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, Germany adopted new legislation which stipulates that large enterprises will have to conduct a risk analysis on the respect of social standards and environmental norms in their own operations and their first tier of suppliers, and this from 2023, so that's in 2 years' time. And similar discussions are being held in many other countries as well. And I'm sure nobody has missed that the European Commission is also preparing a proposal in this area, and we will shortly hear about their work. As the EU is a large economic player, I think an initiative on mandatory due diligence could have major implications, particularly if global supply chains are included. One important element of due diligence is stakeholder engagement, and I'm thinking in particular of social dialogue. Social dialogue allows workers and trade unions to raise problems which might occur. But social dialogue is not only valuable as a source of information, it also provides a way for businesses to put into practice the requirements of avoiding and addressing adverse impact through the process of social dialogue. And later today, we will hear examples how this is being done through collective bargaining, local framework agreements, and other instruments. The role of social dialogue in due diligence is also recognized by the ILO Tripartite Declaration of Principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy, and also the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. But I'm not going to go into that because I think we will hear a bit more about that later. But I also want to mention the due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, which was adopted by the OECD in 2018. So this guidance is also quite recent. But the point that I want to make is that social dialogue is important for due diligence, but the opposite is also true. So due diligence is important for social dialogue as it helps reinforce freedom of association and collective bargaining. But it's now time to introduce the speakers. And as you can see from the agenda, there have been some last-minute changes. We now have 6 speakers representing the European Commission, the OECD, Fair Trade, the Netherlands, ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, and the ILO. And hopefully we will have some time left for comments and questions after the presentations. But you can also use the chat function if you want to raise any issue. And I would now like to start with our first speaker, Evelyn Fisher. She's the team leader, ILO relations in the Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion at the European Commission. Evelyn, she will explain the reasons for the Commission initiative on mandatory due diligence, which is expected later this year. And she will also stress how it links up with their work on decent work and strengthening social dialogue. And I'm really pleased that Evelyn was able to make it today, as she's replacing a colleague that has fallen ill. So thank you very much, Evelyn. And also just to say that because of this, Evelyn will not be able to stay throughout the meeting this afternoon. So I think after this presentation, we can take one question for Evelyn. So if there is something in particular you want to raise, just put it in the chat function and we can then ask Evelyn. But now, Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, sorry, colleagues, and indeed apologizes in advance if I'm not completely responding to your wishes, as yeah, I hope you will be indulgent with me replacing last minute my colleague. So of course I will tell what are the latest on the mandatory due diligence file in the making at the Commission, but would like to start with what already exists in the EU and as EU policies that support due diligence and social dialogue in this context. Just 3 elements in advance on the link between due diligence and social dialogue. First of all, of course, human rights due diligence includes due diligence regarding freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, which are conditions for social dialogue. Because these are part of the body, the instrument, international instruments in this regard are part of the body of international human rights. The second aspect is that due diligence process should support social dialogue and not be in independent or in contradiction with social dialogue. And the third is that, of course, social dialogue is important for effective due diligence process. And let me look first to the existing EU policies to promote decent work, human rights due diligence, and the role of social dialogue in that context. Second, EU cooperation with and support to international organizations in this field. And third, so these latest developments, EU developments on human rights due diligence, mandatory human rights due diligence, and the role of social dialogue. So starting with the existing EU policies, there is already an existing European toolbox actually for linking for human rights due diligence and linking human rights due diligence and social dialogue. Foundation for that are to be found in the EU European treaties and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which already provides both for the support to fundamental principles and rights at work and social dialogue. As far as 2006, there was the founding documents in the European Union for promoting decent work for all. This was a commission communication on this to promote decent work actually in all European internal and external policies that were also supported by the other EU institutions, the Council and the Parliament. And this was actually before the definition of decent work through the ILO Social Justice Declaration 2008, which provides that fundamental principles and rights at work, including freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining and social dialogue are 2 of the strategic objectives of decent work, together with child labor and forced labor and discrimination. And and also employment and social protection. And these objectives are inseparable, interrelated, and mutually supportive. So already bringing together the aspect of human rights, fundamental principles and rights at work, and social dialogue, and further brought into the UN, of course, UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in particular SDG 8. It also provides the ILO Social Justice Declaration that the violation of fundamental principles and rights at work cannot be invoked or used as a legitimate comparative advantage. And this has brought a series of EU actions to promote decent work in the context of trade relations in particular. On this existing toolbox, a mapping has been made in October 2020 through a Commission staff working document on promoting decent work worldwide, responsible global value chains for a fair, sustainable, and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. All references to the document I will quote. I will send you to share for the participants, so that colleagues can easily find a reference to the documents I'm quoting here. I'm referring to here. And so this document can be interesting because it lists all possible EU activities that promote decent work in global supply chain, responsible business conduct, social dialogue in this context, and already shows what can be used in the promotion of due diligence and the role of social dialogue in this due diligence. The second aspect refers to trade. There has been, since 2006, a strong development of labor provisions in EU trade agreements and also preferences. And these are accompanied by an involvement of social partners, by mechanism for social dialogue, and also the promotion of responsible business conduct activities. So the trade agreements of the EU with partner countries are accompanied by these activities that can be a source for social dialogue in the context of due diligence. There has been also, this aspect have also been dealt with in the European human rights strategies that integrates fundamental principles and rights at work, including freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining in all EU human rights activities, being dialogues, being support to activities, and this is notably referred to more specifically in the latest human rights policy from March 2020, which runs until 2024, which calls for action to engage with the business sector to promote human rights, due diligence, and enhancing job creation along the value chains, which call for support of multi-stakeholder processes to develop, implement, and strengthen standards on business and human rights and due diligence, to support advocacy work, enable spaces for business engagement with civil society, and support partner countries in the implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So there are already elements of policies here on which can be used in the for all actors in this process. There's also there has been an EU agenda for corporate responsibility, especially in with the communication of the Commission of 2011, back in 2011, which then included the promotion of social dialogue activities through transnational company agreements. Transnational company agreements or international framework agreements, depending on how they are called, and also putting in place a database of these agreements, which shows activities in this regard, social dialogue activities related to the promotion of decent work at company level. This also led to a transparency legislation of the EU, which is a called the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which can be an important basis for social dialogue at company level, being at European or national level, because companies are obliged, big companies are obliged in Europe to disclose all information regarding human rights, social and employee matters. In April this year, so some weeks ago, the Commission proposed to revise this non-financial reporting directive, which would expand the scope to all large and listed companies and reinforces the requirement for information and audit. Actually, this is could be an important basis for information, consultation, social dialogue, for example, in European Works Councils or in national bodies of workers' representation. There is also an EU law on public procurement, which has been revised in 2014, and which provides that member states should take appropriate measures so to ensure that public procurement does not infringe national, EU and international labor law obligations, including freedom of association and collective bargaining, and also allow to take social consideration related to human rights due diligence when in public procurement. These are, however, quite poorly used in social dialogue so far, even though, for example, public procurement is an important share of GDP in our countries. So let me then just say some words regarding the cooperation with the international organizations, so strong cooperation with the UN, with the ILO, including the ILO regarding the tripartite declaration, M&E declaration, with Gita will address, OECD, G7, G20, but also through a number of projects with these development cooperation projects and activities and research activities with these organizations. On the latest developments, yes, so in 2020 there were studies commissioned by the Commission, published, that indicated, that favored mandatory due diligence from the EU. There has been in 2020 and 2021 a number of European Green Deal implementing strategies that indicates that the Commission will issue mandatory due diligence across value chains, including with the to involve stakeholders in this process. Since December 2020, all EU institutions have called for this human rights mandatory due diligence process, but also for the update of the Commission 2006 communication on promoting decent work for all. So this is a case of Council conclusions in December 2020 on human rights and decent work in global supply chains. That also included an aspect regarding EU-wide sector dialogues and scaling up national sectoral approaches on human rights due diligence. The Parliament in March 2020-21 on binding requirements on due diligence, but also the role of stakeholders to raise concern with a particular focus on the involvement of trade unions. And lately, so the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan of the Commission in March 2021 and supported by the Porto Summit in May, that provides a communication on decent work worldwide, an initiative on sustainable corporate governance, and guidance notices on socially responsible public procurement, as well as support to social dialogue at EU and national levels, upcoming initiatives of the Commission. So different aspects that already exist with a big variety of tools, but also the upcoming initiative on mandatory due diligence, but also the review of EU policy regarding decent work worldwide.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. We are really looking forward to see these new initiatives. I think it will be very interesting to see what they will contain. And I understand it's difficult to talk about something that has not yet been put forward, of course. I don't see any questions in the chat, but we did get some questions when people registered for this meeting. And there's one question on how should companies implement human rights due diligence in countries where the right of workers and employers to form and join organizations of their own choosing is restricted, and where there are no national institutions to encourage collective bargaining? So I was wondering, Evelyn, do you have any thoughts on this which you would like to share with us? I mean, I think this is a question we can pick up in the discussion later on, but I wanted to raise it now in case you have any particular insights that you would like to share with us.
Yes, this is why the relation with the protection of the fundamental right to freedom of association and collective bargaining is very high. So it's not only at the level of the companies, but it is all the relations between the level of the companies and the level of the states, no? And this is why the fact to link already, for example, now the responsible business conduct aspect with the trade agreements which promote, which have as conditions the respect for fundamental principles and rights at work is important, for example. But also at the company level, so I know in the context of transnational company agreements, of international framework agreements, companies who organize regular follow-up of what's happening in the different countries in which they are implemented, or on which they have important shares of their supply chains, and where if this includes a country in which there is actually no real trade union representation, for example, it can be also in a way supported by or helped by the fact to establish a regional representation follow-up bodies, no, that are able to look after more regular exchanges with workers in the country where freedom of association does not exist effectively, and also the involvement of European or regional or international trade union federations can help a lot to support the work with the countries in which there is so far no freedom of association and that is effective. That are some of the aspects, but this is why also for example, in the context of the trade agreements, the mechanism of of involvement of social partners and other stakeholders in the monitoring of the trade agreements is also important, because then you have also the level, the national level beyond the level of the companies themselves.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate that you took the time to explain a little bit more about the work of the Commission. We are now going to move to our next speaker, Dorothy Lovell, who is Policy Research Advisor at the Center for Responsible Business Conduct within the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs at the Rbc. Dorothy will discuss how social dialogue can help implement due diligence, but also how the process of due diligence can reinforce social dialogue.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Veronica, and thanks for inviting me to join this panel. I'm coming from the Center for Responsible Business Conduct within the OECD. Just before I start, a quick overview, I guess, so to put into context the scope of our work. So we really work across 3 different pillars. The middle pillar is perhaps the one most interesting for our discussion today. So our guidance to businesses on due diligence. But it's important, I think, to be aware that, of course, we also work directly with our 50 governments that are adherent to these tools, plus other governments, and some examples of the work that we do extra or outside of our direct government. So, of course, these great programs that we have in conjunction with we're delivering with the ILO, also on this panel, and supported very well by the EU, for example, our Responsible Supply Chains in Asia project, and a project in the LAC region, also with the UNOHCHR. And again, working across all 3 pillars in that region. And so the 3rd pillar is also our national contact point mechanism, and this comes in really from the remedy perspective, because it sets up a kind of mediation platform for individuals or organizations to bring complaints about specific harms that they've experienced, which are linked to or caused by, contributed to, perhaps by multinationals, to a national contact point of the OECD. So all of our work on responsible business conduct is, of course, underpinned or overseen by our multinational enterprise guidelines, last updated in 2011. This and the core part of this is where due diligence as a tool is introduced and linked to these different areas of business ethics, essentially. And you can see where the topic for today fits, which is in the employment and industrial relations section. But of course, since 2011, we now have a human rights chapter in the guidelines, and that's flowing down through into our specific guidance instruments. Important to note how this fits into the broader environment of global standards. So we have, of course, the UN Guiding Principles, also put out in 2011, also with due diligence defined within it, and then the ILO Tripartite Declaration of Principles Concerning Multinational Enterprises and Social Policy, which Geeta, of course, is on the panel today to talk about. And of course, the idea is that this all due diligence flows through to our sustainable development goals. So it's not just about preventing harm, but also addressing, really sustainable development. Okay, so next slide. So due diligence, and how does social dialogue fit in? Well, I think Evelyn really well explained that it's both comes in through the process. So due diligence is only an effective process if it involves meaningful stakeholder engagement. I don't think I need to tell the audience here too much about what meaningful stakeholder engagement means, but clearly it's a two-way communication process, and it involves the good faith of all parties, timely sharing of relevant information. How is it integrated within the cycle? Well, you can see pretty much at every stage of due diligence, companies should be considering and consulting with the stakeholders. And again, which stakeholders are relevant? It's the ones who are most potentially impacted by the business operations versus perhaps the most accessible stakeholders. And I think that's important to realize. Perhaps from an example from the garment sector and what the garment guidance really says about this, it's that enterprises, the most affected stakeholder in the garment sector is usually workers. I don't think that's particularly controversial to say here. And so, of course, the key representative for workers would be trade unions where they exist, or, of course, representative organizations of workers' own choosing. And then in terms of what actual due diligence processes they should be involved in and should be consulted, the guidance says that they should actively participate in the design and implementation of these following processes. So on-site supplier assessments, development of corrective action plans, verification, validation, and monitoring of impacts, design of operational level grievance mechanisms, and of course, in the very scoping of risk in the first place and understanding what the prioritization process that businesses should take. Okay, then just to also mention back to what Evelyn mentioned, that of course, not only is it in the process that social dialogue and meaningful stakeholder engagement should take place, so the process of due diligence, but also that due diligence and all of the RBC standards actually obviously focus on the risks related to that kind of link to social dialogue, such as freedom of association and collective bargaining. And of course, these are key risks in pretty much any sector, I think, that we can think of where there are workers, but they are particularly of focus in particular in certain sectors. And for the RBC guidances that we have in the at the OECD, of course, this has come out more again in the garment sector, in the agricultural sector, and it's also a key running theme through our general due diligence guidance, which is applicable to any sector. So just before I close, I just wanted to give a couple of quick examples of where we see this playing out in initiatives in the sector. Again, I'm taking these from the garment sector. I make no apology for that, but it just happens to be my kind of area. So firstly, to note, of course, that, and it's an interesting question that Veronica just posed to Evelyn about what to do where there are, where the country context makes this particular risk, freedom of association, collective bargaining, a very high or prevalent risk. Of course, multinational enterprises have had to deal with this, and one way that they have worked together with unions is through these global framework agreements. Other speakers may well speak to this particular mechanism, but I've put on the slide here an example from Industrial Global Union's website, where they've listed all the different bilateral agreements that they have. This is obviously important, an important example of brands and global unions using the leverage that they have to try and create and support mechanisms where these are not necessarily supported at the local level. Another example more at a country level is perhaps an interesting one is the Myanmar Freedom of Association Guideline. This was negotiated between employers and workers in the garment and footwear sector in Myanmar. But also to note that, again, multinational enterprises and global union, industrial global union, have actually really worked to bring leverage to this particular situation too. And so, for example, you can see an example from ACT on Living Wages website, where they note that it's now actually a criteria of membership for their organization, that if brands are working in that particular country, that they should put into practice this particular, that they should make it a requirement for their factories to collaborate and cooperate with this particular mechanism. I think that's probably enough from me, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. I think it was really useful that you share these concrete examples with us. And I think it's also important to note, which you did at the beginning, that these OECD tools, they have a wider application than just the OECD member states, and there are several governments that have signed up voluntarily to these different tools. I will now turn to our next speaker, Hester Janssens, who is Policy and Advisory, Advocacy Officer, Policy and Advocacy Officer at Fairtrade Netherlands. Hester will focus her presentation on how to carry out due diligence in practice, and how to avoid that due diligence becomes a ticking boxes exercise, and also how to ensure that due diligence is a process of positive structural change with close involvement of stakeholders and social dialogue. So Hester, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you for inviting me today to speak on behalf of Fairtrade on how to make human rights due diligence work for farmers and workers. As said, I am Hester Janssens. I'm Policy and Advocacy Officer at a Dutch organization, part of the International Fairtrade System, which is there almost already 30 years to change trade for the better, of course, and to make a system-wide changes to adapting trading practices to ensure farmers and workers can achieve a living income and living wages. So as discussed today already by the other speakers, we see a very concrete trend towards mandatory HRD instruments being implemented or being drafted at the moment on various levels, amongst which on EU level, of course, but also in my home country. In the Netherlands, we've seen a lot of developments aside from the voluntary instruments that are already in place. Of course, Fairtrade welcomes these discussions very much, and the implementation of legislation, we believe, is very important for achieving, amongst others, living incomes and living wages in the end. However, even though the momentum is now, we also really see that after 10 years of course, UNGPs and OECD guidelines, we only have 9 years left to achieve the SDGs, and we are far from having human rights available for all. So we basically see the current discussions on what these legislative proposals could mean, focusing maybe sometimes more on what it means for companies and businesses instead of what these instruments could mean for farmers and workers or rights holders in supply chains. A lot of focus, of course, on feasibility, on proportionality and cost sharing, all very important discussions to have. But for Fairtrade, we are there for the farmers and workers and want to focus more on how these instruments, existing instruments, but also the new instruments, when they become mandatory, will be able to impact farmers and workers' lives concretely on a daily basis. That's what we're talking about, of course. And meaningful stakeholder engagement. So social dialogue, of course, but making it a bit broader today from my point of view. Meaningful stakeholder engagement is crucial in that, and not always in practice at the moment. So let's go back a bit. So I'm talking about rights holders and farmers and workers. Well, who are we talking about then? So fair trade is there for the millions of farmers and workers who produce our food, our garments on a daily basis. They are experiencing their human rights being under pressure, amongst which because of unfair trading practices. Of course, human rights violations have many contextual factors as well we should take into account, but trading practices can lead to human rights violations on a daily basis. For example, and I'm just going to name a few because they are, of course, so prevalent in supply chains, especially agricultural supply chains. Low prices or extreme price pressure, of course, lead to the violations of decent working conditions, a decent standard of living, lead to possibly child labor and the right to living income and living wage. We've seen that in the current trading practices, long-term commitments are not very much in practice. The deadlines are being pushed often, which lead to violations of decent working conditions, forced labor, etc. Of course, what we're talking about today is, and we are all aware of that, is that when businesses, organizations discourage or even punish for participation in trade unions, the freedom of association and collective bargaining are under pressure, but also trading practices that lead to dumping polluted water, violate the right to clean drinking water. And as we all know, women are often overrepresented in doing the hardest tasks. For example, on plantations, working with no suitable clothing, whilst working with agrochemicals, which violates, of course, the right to non-discrimination and decent working conditions and health. Fair trade really understands that poverty is one of the main root causes of many human rights and environmental violations. As long as people are poor, other human rights will be under pressure as well. We all know that. When farmers are trapped in poverty, they really can't afford to invest in their sustainable agricultural practices. They may even have to put their children to work, and that's why they can't attend school, even though education could be free. If you have no money to pay for books, clothing, etc., your children will still not be able to attend school. That's why we always say it's a bit unnuanced, but you can build as many schools as you want as long as people are in extreme poverty. Children still won't go to school and schools will remain empty. So that is why we make a sincere plea to put living incomes and living wages at the front and center of due diligence practices, because they are enabling rights, also linking directly to freedom of association and collective bargaining. Without addressing those enabling rights, the other rights will be not in scope, or more out of scope, maybe is to say. So I don't think I have to explain the 6 steps of the due diligence cycle. Dorothy already mentioned it just for now, and also explained to us again that stakeholder engagement and social dialogue is part of every step of the due diligence cycle. So that's easy for me, so I can reserve some time for the other input I want to give. And the only thing that I would still want to, well, maybe state is that without meaningful stakeholder engagement, there is no due diligence. So that's just something that we cannot state enough, I guess. So again, a plea for meaningful stakeholder engagement in all steps of the due diligence cycle, either on supply chain level or on community level. It doesn't always have to mean that you need to jump on a plane and visit the farmers or workers in your supply chain. There are steps before that as well. Get to know your supply chain, get to know the producer organizations, the traders, the buyers, industry bodies. And then maybe, if possible, you can, if you go beyond tier 1, you can understand on a community level representatives of, for example, boys, girls, workers, trade unions, committees, etc. The basic point I basically want to make here is that you just need to get to know your supply chain and really discover who all the actors are. And then from then on, you can always dig deeper, but just start. So in theory, basically, due diligence instruments could pave the way for freedom of association and living incomes and all those enabling rights to be available for all. However, research has shown that in the current way that HREDD processes are being implemented, often stakeholder engagement is not implemented correctly. This also means that due diligence does not necessarily lead to improved conditions for those rights holders. And that is worrisome, of course, because if it's poorly implemented, it can lead to unintended negative consequences, whereas it is meant to have positive impact or less negative impact. It could lead to companies cutting and running. It could lead to business passing the additional costs of compliance to suppliers. And basically fair trade also worries like, okay, if it's just a tick boxing exercise, how would that impact, for example, the 60 million children who, based on the most recent estimates, are in child labor at the beginning of 2020, which is pre-COVID. So we can only imagine what has happened in the last 18 months. The number would have increased probably. So there really is, when we're talking about addressing root causes, a huge difference between what happens on paper and what happens in practice. And what looks good on paper could have no impact in practice, or could even have an unintended negative consequence in practice. So just some questions, just to get our heads thinking in the same way. What does a grievance channel, which would look good on paper, mean when workers don't know about it, or when it's in a different language than their local language, or if they fear repercussions from their employers if they use that grievance channel? We all know that doesn't make any sense then. What do supplier requirements mean when suppliers don't have the resources and the leverage to adapt and enable change on the ground? So if deadlines are pushed even further, how can we expect them to enable change? How can farmers be expected to change their agricultural practices, for example, when working with workers on their farms, if they are in extreme poverty? How can we expect farmers to have good, decent working conditions for their workers on the land if they have literally zero money to implement those practices? How can companies even know what are the most salient risks in their supply chains without engaging in verifying with the ones that they're talking about? So if it's just a desk research, without engaging at least with representatives of the rights holders, how do you know what to act on first? So rights holder inclusive due diligence really works both ways. Of course, business needs stakeholder engagement to comply with OECD and UNGP, and farmers and workers really need to be at the front and center to drive the change themselves. You cannot oppose change, you need to enable change. That's basically what they want and what they need. This also means for fair trade that we need to bring that in practice. Of course, producers are the focus of our work. They own 50% of the General Assembly of the fair trade system. And think about, for example, how we engage, how we include social dialogue and a bottom-up perspective in plantations, for example, banana plantations. Well, the workers have both decision-making and advisory power at the fair trade system. For example, via the Workers' Rights Advisory Committee, which is not only an advisory council, but also a platform for dialogue. Our standards require the right to unionize guarantee for employers to implement and to actively engage with trade unions and workers and to develop a plan together on how to work towards living wage. Fair trade, of course, is also organizing trainings for workers to understand their rights better. So sensitivity training, sensibility trainings, to understand how to engage with management, etc. And the workers themselves own the additional fair trade premium, the way that can be spent in their communities, for example, on health or gender or organizational safety. This goes the same for smallholder farmers. At the core of our approach is a bottom-up perspective on how to address human rights and mitigate violations. For example, on child labor, it really starts with awareness raising. It's so much more than just stating strict quotes on what is allowed and what isn't allowed. It's about awareness raising, about very sensitive contextual issues as well, targeted risk assessments, and ending definitely with a child protection policy and detailed monitoring protocols, for example. So to sum up, basically dialogue and engagement needs to take place, including all the stakeholders, with an emphasis on more equitable participation of producers and workers and their community members. Which needs a greater balance of power and truly enabling the stakeholders to learn and evolve. I don't think I have, because I have to be quite strict on the time, I assume, Veronica, I don't know, there's just one example I wanted to mention on how as fair trade certified farmers association tackled their child labor problems through really a bottom-up process on which they owned the mediation, monitoring and remediation system on child labor. But I will, I think, cut that short a bit. I've already mentioned how important it is to put them at the front and center of due diligence. That's also our call to action for today, a plea that I want to make towards all government organizations to implement HRDD legislation that covers the whole supply chain, going beyond tier 1. If we don't go beyond tier 1, so it needs to be in line with OECD, those rights holders will never be reached, and it simply will not have a positive or less negative impact on them at all. There needs to be explicit reference to that stakeholder engagement and social dialogue in the legislation, because if it's not explicitly in the legislation, it will probably be one of the last things in line when implementing due diligence. Living incomes and living wages, it goes for the same. They need to be recognized explicitly, just as freedom of association, as enabling rights, so that business know that if they want to comply with the legislation, they need to tackle those enabling rights first. And adapting trading practices, of course, is a core part of that. Only then can legislation also prevent cut and run. And then for business, it's basically the same call to action, put farmers and workers at the front and center of due diligence. And as said, that doesn't necessarily mean to jump on a plane tomorrow, but really it's about how to engage it in all the steps of your process, and not just when checking or verifying all the things that you've drafted on commitments or papers. So it's really to go beyond tier 1. And I understand that that's very difficult, but there are so many human rights experts or NGOs or organizations that can help in that. Stakeholder engagement needs to be part of every step of the way, and including rights holders actively without adapting those trading practices. Living incomes and living wages and other enabling rights will be far out of sight probably. Just remember the quote I just had on, you can build as many schools as you want, as long as people are in extreme poverty, children won't go to school anyway. And fair pricing is a crucial part to enable those enabling rights. And of course, that also means that fair trade has a responsibility as a partner, just as many other NGOs or civil society organizations, but only when we work together and combine the voluntary instruments with the mandatory instruments. So my co-colleague in the Netherlands will start talking about more of the voluntary instruments, which play a crucial role in achieving that system-wide change. Only then can it really be a difference between paper and practice for the farmers and workers. So thank you very much for having me. And that's it for today.
Thank you so much, Hester. Well, we are really falling behind schedule, but maybe we can come back to the example in the discussion, because it's always interesting to have these concrete examples. I think you have really raised the difficulties, the key questions, the tricky questions here, and which I hope we can discuss later on. I would like to move straight ahead to our next speaker, Charlotte Bernard, who is Senior Policy Advisor at the Directorate for Economic Development in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. Charlotte will present the experience of the Netherlands with sectoral stakeholder agreements on responsible business conduct, bringing different partners together to uphold fundamental rights. So over to you, Charlotte.
Yes, thank you, Veronica, for giving me the opportunity to tell you something about the Dutch policy on RBC and also linked to social dialogue. I hope everybody can hear me fine. Otherwise, please let me know. Maybe we can go to the next slide, please. First, I will shortly describe our Dutch RBC policy. It is based on the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, Business and Human Rights, and on the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which were already mentioned earlier. And this means that we expect that companies should perform due diligence, and the RBC risks they look into should also include human rights and labor rights violations like freedom of association and collective bargaining. Next slide, please. The idea for the Rbc Sector Agreements came in 2014. In that year, KPMG did a sector risk analysis on RBC in the Netherlands. And this research came up with 14 high-risk sectors for the Netherlands. And that are sectors that are important for the Dutch economy, but also have high RBC risks in the chain. And based on the outcomes of this research, the Rbc Sector Agreements started. And these are voluntary sector-based agreements between businesses, civil society organizations, including trade unions, and the government about international responsible business conduct. And at the moment, there are 11 agreements, as you can see on this slide. One is still in negotiation, that's the one on agriculture, and 2 have already ended. That's the one on sustainable forestry and the one in the banking sector. Next slide, please. In the Rbc sector agreements, businesses work together with the other involved stakeholders to tackle the RBC risks in their supply chains. And it focuses on a two-way approach. Firstly, on doing due diligence and supporting businesses in doing that. And this can be done by developing tools and guidelines and organizing trainings. And secondly, by setting up coordinated projects, for example, in the area of social dialogue. Next slide, please. And on this last note, I would like to look at 2 specific projects on promoting social dialogue that are a result of the Rbc sector agreements. First, it's in the garments and textile industry. Under this Rbc agreement, the Amplify project was started in 2020, in which the Dutch trade unions, FNV and CNV, support Dutch companies to stimulate freedom of association and social dialogue in their supply chains. Companies can get one-to-one support in developing, implementing, reflecting, and improving their action plans for freedom of association at production locations. And well, how is that done? Well, the project offers companies 1 or more action tracks. First, parties can share knowledge about freedom of association in general or for more specific countries. And by getting tailor-made advice, businesses are supported in their assessment of freedom of association in their supply chains. And secondly, internal due diligence processes on human rights aspects can be improved by evaluating internal policies in which specific attention is paid to freedom of association. And thirdly, suppliers can be involved by improving formal contracts or organizing events for suppliers on stimulating freedom of association. Another option is for businesses to get in touch with local experts that can organize a training for workers and employers on social dialogue. And lastly, collective bargaining processes can be set up locally with support of experts. So that's all included in this project. And as I mentioned, this project started in 2020 and is still running. And then I would like to look at the banking sector agreement. In the context of this agreement, the banking sector did an analysis of severe human rights issues in the palm oil value chain. And this analysis showed that the existence of good collective bargaining agreement between a company and its workers is an indicator that basic rights are better arranged. And to have a good collective bargaining agreement, good social dialogue on company or sectoral level is important. The partners of the banking sector agreement believe that transparency on labor rights at palm oil plantations is a first step to achieve better working conditions for workers, support social dialogue, and promote freedom of association, and direct the investment towards transformational change. Therefore, the project aims to collect and map collective bargaining agreements with local stakeholders in order to set up a database on agreements, which will not only be analyzed, but also receive a rating. This database provides valuable data for different parties to address and mitigate labor rights risks. And this project also started in 2020 and runs until next year. Well, as both projects are still running, it is difficult to already give results of the project, but I wanted at least to show you that there are some examples of projects that are running, and that the Rbc sector agreements can be a stimulus for projects on supporting social dialogue in global supply chains. And it's not just limited to projects in the Rbc sector agreements. The Dutch government also supports other programs from trade unions, for example, in the garments and textile industry, which also have a strong focus on promoting social dialogue, freedom of association, and collective bargaining in supply chains, and so also linked to due diligence. Next slide, please. And then I would like to go back to our RBC policy, as the government evaluated the policy last year. And this evaluation showed that the voluntary measures like the Rbc agreements are not doing enough to improve conditions in the supply chain. Therefore, the government presented a mix of measures to support responsible business conduct and due diligence. A mix of monitoring and reporting on due diligence, of outreach to companies, of facilitation to stakeholders, of emphasis on cooperation, and for clear minimum standards for due diligence. Next slide, please. And on this last aspect, maybe you wonder whether the Netherlands doesn't already have a due diligence act in place, namely the child labor due diligence law. And it is true that this law was adopted, but it has not yet entered into force. The objective of this child labor due diligence law is that consumers can assume that the goods and services they buy on the Dutch market are sold by companies that make sure that products and services are not produced by child labor. Therefore, the law requires from companies that they perform due diligence and identify and prevent child labor in their supply chains. However, several elements of this law are not clear yet and have to be worked out in lower level regulation. These elements are, well, what should be included in the due diligence statement of companies? What should the plan of action of companies look like? Should there be companies excluded of the law? And who should be the supervisor of the law? When the law passed the Senate last year, well, even 2 years ago already, it was agreed that the development of this lower level regulation should start after the evaluation of the Dutch Rbc policy, so it could build upon lessons learned from that evaluation. And that means that we are now working on the building blocks for due diligence law, either a broad due diligence legislation or a more specific law on child labor. However, our starting point is to have a broad due diligence legislation, and therefore we welcome an ambitious European legislative proposal on due diligence. Next slide, please. That's just to end, because this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your attention. And please, well, if there's time, do not hesitate to ask your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was really a useful presentation. And I think to know more about these different agreements that you have managed to conclude in the Netherlands. And now it is time for our next speaker, Rowan Subwa, who is the legal director of the International Transport Workers Federation. And Rowan will provide also some more examples of how social dialogue is mobilized to conduct due diligence in the European road transport and global shipping sector. So thank you very much, Rowan, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and good day to all from Montreal. So I'll get straight into it. Everyone can see my presentation, right? Yes, can. So the International Transport Workers Federation is the global union body representing transport workers across all transport modes, from shipping to fisheries and aviation to road transport. And we represent roughly 20 million working people around the world. And I think one of the key issues that we deal with on a regular basis is the fact that many of these workers are what we call out of sight, out of mind. So we're dealing with mobile transport workers, migrant workers working across multiple borders. We're talking about some of the most dangerous occupations in the world. And then if you consider the particular vulnerabilities that young workers and women workers face in these sectors, it is what we say a pretty big human rights due diligence blind spot for many companies at the top of global supply chains, which rely on transport workers in every single facet of their business model. So ever since the UNGPs were published in 2011, we've been of the view that meaningful stakeholder engagement with the ITF and our affiliates will be a critical piece in helping companies meet their HRDD obligations when it comes to transport and logistics. And as part of this, of course, we very much push the idea that meaningful stakeholder engagement with unions and global union federations is a key piece here, as reflected in the general due diligence guidance to the OECD M&E guidelines, which of course refer to direct relationships with the global unions. And of course, even if we look at the revised M&E declaration of the ILO, which focuses on the centrality of freedom of association, we really think, especially in a sector like this, that we can make a difference and help companies in their journey towards HRDD in this sector. So I'm going to focus on two particular examples where I think that social dialogue within the context of HRDD has provided some positive outcomes for workers. Now, in March 2020, when the pandemic hit, one of the main policy responses of individual governments and indeed at the multilateral level was to ensure that global supply chains continued functioning so that basic commodities and medicines could continue to be traded, and that essential items appeared on supermarket shelves around the world. But I think what many people did not envisage was what we call the crew change crisis in the shipping sector. So basically in the shipping industry, of course, seafarers work aboard merchant vessels. They need to join ships, and they also need to get off and allow others to join the ships to work on these vessels. We're talking about 1.6 million seafarers that work in the merchant marine. We reached a point last summer where, because of COVID-19 related travel restrictions imposed by governments, we had up to 400,000 seafarers trapped at sea, working beyond their legal limits. Seafarers who are effectively stuck in situations of forced labor, not being able to leave when at the end of their contracts. Seafarers who had no access to medical leave or shore leave. Seafarers who are suffering tremendous mental health issues and physical health issues to boot. And we even had several suicides of seafarers resulting from this situation. And I must say, right now, as we speak, there are still about 200,000 seafarers trapped at sea in this particular situation. So of course, this should have sent alarm bells ringing for multinational companies and other companies that rely on shipping for the transport of their goods right from the outset. So what we did was immediately say, look, we know that this is a complex situation that cannot be dealt with individually by any company or government. So we got together with our direct social partner, the International Chamber of Shipping, to work on a series of protocols which both governments and companies can use to try and alleviate this crisis for seafarers. And after even just a few weeks of very difficult negotiations, we managed to bring these protocols to the attention of various UN agencies, which was since then adopted. And since then, we've had statements from the UN Secretary General, resolutions of the UN General Assembly, ILO resolutions, all calling for action by enterprises to meet those meet the obligations under those protocols. So we took that to the next level, and thanks to the leadership of the UN Global Compact, and who led this process, together with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the ILO and the IMO, together with technical advice and expertise of the OECD, we put in place this toolkit, which would help companies navigate this space during the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail on the tool itself, which I'm sure we can share afterwards, Veronica, with the group. But fundamentally what this does is to literally put in place some clear actions that cargo owners, so these are the companies that are transporting their goods, can take to make sure that seafarers are not stuck in this ordeal, and other actions that they can take together with shipping charterers to ensure that seafarers are not serving on board their vessels beyond their legal limits. So again, this is just sort of a screenshot of what the toolkit looks like, and I just want to focus particularly on the first section, which are the concrete items that cargo owners or companies can do to ensure that seafarers are not being forced to work beyond their contracts, that they're getting access to medical leave, etc., and how we as the ITF can help companies in this journey. So what we've been doing, and with permission from this company TFG London, which is an apparel and garment brand, they were one of the first companies to approach us to ask us what they can actually do to help seafarers stuck in these situations when, frankly, they admitted to not knowing what was going on. All they knew was that their logistics providers were procuring the shipments, and that was the end of it. So again, shipping and transport work was very much a blind spot in the HRD process. And to this company's credit, they reached us directly, and what we did was basically say, look, we have an army of inspectors around the world across, I believe, 140 odd ports that conduct vessel inspections. We have networks of trade unionists across the world that have access to labor and transport ministries, so on and so forth. And we have access to a lot of data, which we can then cross-refer to their procurement data and see what is missing and what can be done. Indeed, that's exactly what we did. And thanks to that collaboration, TFG Group were able to go back to their transport providers and literally instruct them on what should be done to alleviate this particular problem for seafarers. And as a result of that, seafarers carrying TFG items definitely had a positive outcome from this experience. And our role in all of this, and this is just a screenshot from our General Secretary's intervention on this particular issue, is that we are always ready to help. So all we're asking companies to do is to get in touch with us. It doesn't matter what the size of your company is, and if you're exposed to this particular problem, we are there to help. And this is just an example of what a health check looks like. If a company provides their data, sits down with us to engage in meaningful social dialogue on how to resolve these particular issues, we can run these health checks based on our data. We can engage our inspectors, and we can work on particular solutions that can help resolve this crisis, certainly on a ship-by-ship basis. So that's my first example, and that, of course, is very much a global situation. Now, for my second example, I'd like to focus in on a more regional issue, and this is in Europe, and here I'm talking about road transport, so trucking. So trucking has traditionally been seen as a relatively safe form of transportation, and without many problems. But in the research that we've been doing together with the Dutch Union VMB Foundation and the International Union of Food Workers, in the research we've been finding all of these things listed on this slide, from starvation pay to the lack of access to toilets, to workers from the Philippines being trafficked into Europe, driving trucks from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, in an industry where it's hard to imagine that you'd have forced labor of this nature. So basically, our research shows that one of the biggest reasons this is the case is because of the really almost unthinkable levels of subcontracting in this sector. And again, with a lot of these drivers working on roads day and night, being out of sight and out of mind, it ended up being an HRDD blind spot. So what have we been doing? What we've been doing is trying to come up with a solution, which is what we call the RTDD, the Road Transport Due Diligence Model. This is us basically working with major supply chain customers, or as we call them, economic employers sitting at the top of the supply chain, to try and combine their sort of top-down market expertise with our bottom-up workplace information gathering and implementation work to cooperate on real-world case studies of exploitation to identify the root causes and remedy them. So this HRDD model which we have right now basically is based on minimum standards, which are your ILO standards on working conditions and above, monitoring based on trade union inspectors, trade union information gathering, and empowering workers themselves to act as monitors as part of this, and then a formal remediation program. Now, I won't go into too much detail on the minimum standards. Again, I'm happy to share this afterwards, but it's, as you can imagine, everything from fair wages to access to toilets to access to trade union rights. And then this is perhaps the area that I would like to touch on a bit more, which is the idea that stakeholder engagement with trade unions cannot be a tick box exercise. I think what this model represents is the fact that trade unions can act as a real tool when it comes to monitoring supply chains, which traditional auditing models have completely ignored. And our level of evidence and data gathering provides that real worker-based input that is often lacking in traditional third-party auditing models. And of course, this is based fundamentally on a question of trust that these companies that are engaging with us have to say that this is really what's going to move HRDD to the next level. And based on that analysis, that we then speak to these companies to then look at remedial measures. And this doesn't just mean, basically severing ties with the offending companies. We have a 9-step process, which is based on notification, consultation, restitution, looking at corrective plans to see if these suppliers can, and in that sense, it is a model that looks at all 3 interrelated elements without excluding any of the 3. And as I said, we just formed a foundation, which is meant to shepherd this work going forward. So those are just a couple of examples where I think we can really look at meaningful stakeholder engagement in a practical way, and in an era where we are moving towards mandatory measures. Hopefully some of these examples can inform legislators on what this really means and what engaging with trade unions means throughout the HRDD cycle, and not just at the beginning. Thank you very much, Veronica.
Thank you, Ruben, and hello, everyone. Since Veronica's connection is a bit patchy, she asked me to take over. So my name is Rowan Subwa. I'm working as a policy advisor at the Global Deal, and thank you, Ruben, for these interesting examples. I've always been fascinated how in the European road transport sector you use the model that is usually used between Western multinationals and the global South. How you use that same model to fight and address precarious work in Europe itself. It's really a very good example. Our last speaker for today is Gita Roelants from the ILO. And Gita, you will talk about the central role of social dialogue in due diligence in reference to the ILO Multinational Enterprises Declaration. So Gita, you have the floor, but I would ask you, given the time, to really focus on the key messages. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And well, thank you first of all to also inviting the ILO. I think a number of speakers already made reference to our instruments. So I will just share, a presentation that I put together. As you may know, in the ILO, there have been since 2016 a lot of discussions specifically on due diligence in the context of discussions on decent work in global supply chains. And it's actually good to see a number of those engaged also in the discussions in the ILO to be among the speakers here. In 2016 also we started the review process of the ILO Tripartite Declaration of Principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy, the M&E Declaration, that had not been updated in 2011, as was the case with the OECD. But following the discussion in 2016, basically a decision was made to do a review process of the M&E Declaration, taking into account a number of developments, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And actually, when you look at due diligence, of course, in the UNGPs, you can say, yes, it is embedded in Pillar 2. On due diligence, it is also very much part of how the state, of course, should, in its state duty to protect human rights, should also consider the smart mix of measures, national, international, mandatory, voluntary, to foster business respect for human rights, and then, of course, the access to remedy. So when in the ILO we did the review process of the M&E declaration in 2016-2017, I think we need to bear in mind that this is actually a really unique instrument because social dialogue is really embedded in that instrument, much more than in any of the other international instruments. Because first of all, the recommendations are addressed to governments, enterprises, and social partners. And you basically have the dialogue between those different partners, and I would say different types of dialogue. So between the government and the social partners, within the enterprises, between enterprise management and workers, which is of course industrial relations, between governments, social partners, and multinational enterprises, which is what we call tripartite plus dialogues, and also then between home and host countries of multinational enterprises, the cross-border social dialogue. And I think in relation to that, also when we talk about due diligence, all of these levels of social dialogue or dialogue, I mean, there are many ways of describing social dialogue, but all of these levels actually have a role to play when you talk about business upholding respect for labor rights, as is, of course, the objective of due diligence, because I think we need to also be very careful. You know, due diligence is not an aim in itself, but is basically a tool, a process to enhance the protection of the rights holders. And I think that was also put forward previously. And so if this becomes a kind of tick box exercise, it actually is not anymore going towards what is the objective, namely a much better protection of those rights holders. So in the context of the revised M&E declaration, and these are, I mean, the chapters that we have in the M&E declaration, so it's much more detailed, of course, as what there is in the OECD M&E guidelines, or what you have in the guiding principles. In the general policies already, it talks about fundamental principles and rights at work, calling on all actors to respect these fundamental principles and rights at work. And these were already, as was pointed out, including freedom of association and collective bargaining. It also includes a new paragraph 10, which I will speak a bit more about conducting due diligence. Specifically, due diligence was also included in the employment section on forced labor, and that is actually because the Protocol 29 on forced labor, which is a legally binding standard that has been ratified already by 50 member states of the ILO, includes companies doing due diligence and how governments should support companies conducting due diligence in relation to forced labor. So that was specifically also included in the revision in 2017 of the M&E declaration. And then, of course, the very extensive chapter on industrial relations, where you have freedom of association, collective bargaining, consultations, and access to remedy, examination of grievances, and then settlement of industrial disputes. Now, as I said in the revision in 2017, a new paragraph 10 was included in the M&E declaration. And first of all, it starts from the guiding principles on business and human rights and what is actually put there as due diligence process, namely to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how companies address their actual and potential adverse impacts in relation to internationally recognized human rights. Of course, including at a minimum the Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. So this is actually taken from the guiding principles. Then stating that this process should involve meaningful consultation. And I think everyone has already been speaking about this meaningful consultation. but actually it's the very first time in an international instrument that it spells out including workers' organizations, because you don't find it in the guiding principles on business and human rights, nor do you find it in the OECD M&E guidelines of 2011. So this was an enormous achievement in terms of the revised M&E declaration, and a lot of negotiations happened between workers, employers, and the governments to actually get this element explicit in the revised M&E declaration. And then moreover, a very specific provision was included, namely to achieve the aim of the M&E declaration, which is of course the most comprehensive international instrument on business and decent work, or business and labor rights. This process of due diligence and meaningful consultation should take account of the central role of freedom of association and collective bargaining, as well as industrial relations and social dialogue, as an ongoing process. And I think that also is critically important. It is not a once a process, it is actually part of an ongoing process. And actually social dialogue and industrial relations are also ongoing processes between the different parties, between management and workers' organizations. So due diligence in a way is an ongoing process. And so is, of course, everything in relation to social dialogue and industrial relations. Then in terms of the operational tools, because since the 2017 updated M&E declaration, of course, we've been working a lot with it, and a number of speakers have already made reference to the importance of this paragraph in the revised M&E declaration. But of course, in the context of the ILO Help Desk for Business of International Labour Standards, where we receive direct requests from companies on aligning with international labour standards in their corporate policies and practices, but also build good industrial relations. So when they are conducting their due diligence, we receive indeed a lot of questions on how indeed to have this meaningful consultation with workers' organizations as part of the ongoing due diligence process. Then together with the Bureau for Workers' Activities, we actually put together a guide, the M&E Declaration, What's in it for Workers. And that guide was put out in 2017, so after the updated M&E Declaration. And it contains a number of scenarios of how workers and unions can do due diligence, can use basically due diligence processes as part, to be really part of the consultation processes as part of due diligence process. So a lot of the work that we've also been doing is providing support to workers' organizations on due diligence, because what we've seen is very often the discussions on due diligence is actually a discussion with enterprises, because this was actually in the pillar 2 of the guiding principles. It has become a discussion by governments in the context of the mandatory due diligence. But of course, as we've been saying before, meaningful stakeholder engagement includes, when it comes specifically to human rights of workers, includes workers' organizations. And hence it is very important to also capacitate and engage with workers' organizations so that they can play their critical role in due diligence processes. And someone mentioned of course, the existing due diligence legislation in France, where indeed it is foreseen that there are consultations with workers' organizations. And I think the German legislation is also quite interesting because they link it to the works councils. So I think there also within the European context, this is quite unique because there are, of course, the works councils in the European context, where, of course, due diligence processes could also be an important process to build on what is already happening in the context of European works councils. Then the ILO Company Union Dialogue Facilitation, which of course is a very specific procedure under the M&E Declaration. All of the joint requests that we've received so far from companies and global unions they all were requests in relation to industrial relations. And it is often either in the context of a global framework agreement, but also when a company itself in its corporate policy makes reference to upholding the ILO International Labour Standards or the M&E Declaration or the fundamental principles and rights at work. And so this is also a process that we are, of course, very much supporting, and that also in the context of due diligence is a critical opportunity for engagement. I mean, just to say that, of course, everything we do in the ILO is based on social dialogue, on freedom of association and collective bargaining. So all of these trainings is in relation to this. And also the work that we do with the OECD on due diligence is, of course, based on this new paragraph 10 of the M&E Declaration. And I was very pleased, of course, that in the 2018 due diligence guidance, this was also taken up by the OECD. And so if other governments are now referring to the OECD guidance on due diligence, this is actually indirectly also referring, of course, then to the M&E Declaration, but also with the working group on business and human rights in the context of our, projects that were already mentioned. And also on our M&E Declaration web portal, we have an overview of all of the global framework agreements that include international labor standards and the M&E Declaration. So thank you very much for this opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Gita, for the overview. I think that was really useful. I would suggest that we try to address some of the questions in the chat. There was this last question for Rowan. How important is harmonization of European labor law in the context of the limitations of human rights due diligence?
Yeah, thanks, Veronica, and thanks to Wilbert for the question. I mean, I think on this particular issue, I mean, if we're looking at the road transport example in particular, there is prevailing EU law on the issue, for example, on the habitual place of work of a truck driver. But the problem, of course, is implementation. This is a critical piece, and we, of course, advocate for stronger labor inspectorates, especially in these sectors which are often neglected, and we think enforcement of EU law at the national level is a critical piece here. And that is perhaps also where working with trade unions and trade union inspectors can help bridge that gap where there is a bit of a void when it comes to implementation. But as far as we're concerned, in terms of labor laws governing the sector, we do see a fair level of harmonization, but the problem really is implementation.
Thank you. There was also another question a bit earlier in the session. What is the panel's view about which unions are brought within scope of this, and this is in relation to the French legislation, and can this be improved while respecting the national territory tendencies of social dialogue? I think this is quite a difficult question, but I wanted to raise it because it's been put in the chat, and I want to know if we have any volunteers for this question.
I can have a go. I suppose I have a direct interest in this question. It is true, of course, that we can get into a pretty into sort of bureaucratic space if we talk about which levels of trade unions need to be considered in HRDD processes. But I think this discussion needs to be fundamentally driven by the needs for workers, and the need to actually address gaps in human rights due diligence and how to address violations. So if that means that you should engage with, of course, the unions at the local level, so of where a particular factory is or where workers are based, to the unions of the home country because of the expertise that they have in dealing with, say, for example, a works council of that company, but also then to recognize the role that European trade union federations, for example, or global union federations have in global transnational social dialogue and indeed global collective bargaining. All of these experiences can enhance HRDD. So in that sense, I'm very much of the view that this engaging with unions should be at all levels: local, home country, company home country, regional, and global. And it doesn't have to be bureaucratic. It can be done in an organic way. Yes, there is some competition sometimes, but I think we need to be driven by the needs of workers, and this is what can deliver it. And I do think that legislation can reflect this structure in a pretty relatively easy way, with, of course, a margin of appreciation and discretion on how it is used at the national level.
Thank you, Rowan. I would also like to take the opportunity to say that the tool that you referred to before is also available on the Global Deal website. I think the link was already sent in the chat, but you can also find it on our website. Thank you so much for your valuable input. I think all these examples have been really interesting. And as we have heard, social dialogue is essential for carrying out due diligence. Social dialogue and due diligence reinforce each other mutually. More effective due diligence leads to stronger social dialogue, and stronger social dialogue will result in better due diligence. And the examples we heard from the ITF, the Netherlands, Fair Trade, and others, the Rbc, I think we can learn a lot from these examples. We have also talked quite a lot about the legal initiatives to make due diligence mandatory and the need for mandatory due diligence. One of the speakers, Charlotte from the Netherlands, said that voluntary measures are not enough. And also Gita pointed out that due diligence is not an end in itself. That's important to keep in mind. But I think one argument which we did not really have time to touch upon today is that due diligence can also help to construct a global level playing field, because this relieves pressure on businesses that proceed with caution but might experience a competitive or unfair disadvantage because of this. So this is also an important issue. But I would say that the two obvious lessons from this discussion is that first, social dialogue should have a central place in any due diligence legislation, and that implementation is key for achieving real change. And Hester and Fair Trade pointed out to the many traps we have, and how do we avoid just having this kind of box ticking exercise that we make a difference on the ground. I think that is really the challenge. But the discussions we have had today were really helpful to try to identify these solutions and see what we can do, and also the role that the Global Deal can play in this. So I would just like to finish now, and again, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really enjoyed the presentations and the discussion we had. So thank you very much, and goodbye.